how one pilot flew through enemy lines to save his squadron. A cinematic documentary narrates the sky over the English Channel churned with storm clouds on the morning of August 19, 1942, at precisely 08 for 7 hours. Squadron Leader James Mitchell stood on the tarmac of RAF Tangmere, watching his boots darken with rain. The leather was already worn thin from months of combat sorties, and now they absorbed water like the parched earth of southern England had been doing for 3 days straight. He didn't notice his mind was somewhere over Dieppe, France, where Operation Jubilee, the largest Allied amphibious assault since Gallipoli, was already unraveling into catastrophe. Mitchell was 31 years old, ancient by fighter pilot standards in 1942. Most of his squadron were barely 22, fresh-faced boys who still wrote letters home about the glory of aerial combat. He had stopped writing those letters 2 years ago, after Dunkirk, after the Battle of Britain, after he learned that war strips away romanticism faster than engine oil strips paint from fuselage. But on this morning, as the field telephone rang in the operations room behind him, Mitchell would discover that some forms of heroism cannot be stripped away. They can only be tested until they either shatter or shine. The voice on the other end of that telephone belonged to Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, and he carried the weight of desperation. 6 Spitfires from no 485 squadron had been shot down over Dieppe. 4 pilots were confirmed dead, but 2 flying officer Robert Thompson and pilot officer David Hughes had managed to parachute into the chaos below. They were alive, trapped behind enemy lines in a town that was rapidly becoming a German fortress as the Allied raid collapsed. The Wehrmacht was pouring reinforcements into Dieppe. Within hours, the entire sector would be impenetrable. If anyone was going to extract those pilots, it had to be now. It had to be impossible. It had to be Mitchell. What Leigh-Mallory was asking went beyond the boundaries of tactical sanity. The airspace over Dieppe had become a meat grinder. In the first 4 hours of Operation Jubilee, the Royal Air Force had already lost 91 aircraft more losses in a single morning than most campaigns sustained in a month. German Focke-Wulf 190s dominated the skies, flying from nearby airfields at Avolampoy. Their yellow-nosed fighters tore through Allied formations with mechanical precision, while 88mm flak batteries turned the coastal approach into a curtain of steel. The Luftwaffe had drawn the Allies into a trap, and now they were feasting. Mitchell's squadron had been held in reserve that morning, a decision that probably saved their lives. No. 616 Squadron Spitfire MKVBs sat in their blast pens, engines cold, pilots restless. They had listened to the radio chatter all morning, the desperate calls for air support, the clipped voices announcing kills, the static-filled screams that ended mid. Every pilot knew what those silences meant. Now, Mitchell stood before his men in the operations room, water still dripping from his flight jacket, and explained a mission that sounded like suicide with extra steps. The plan was absurd in its simplicity. Mitchell would fly alone into Dieppe at wavetop height, beneath the German radar coverage, using the storm front as concealment. He would locate Thompson and Hughes, assuming they were still alive, assuming they could signal their position, assuming 1,000 other variables that no sane planner would assume. Then he would land his Spitfire on the beach, pick up 1 pilot, and fly back. The second pilot would have to wait for another attempt, or pray for capture rather than execution. 1 pilot. 2 men to save. Mathematics that didn't add up except in the calculus of desperation. His wingman, flying officer Charles Pemberton, volunteered immediately. So did 5 others. Mitchell refused them all. This wasn't bravery. It was pragmatism. 1 aircraft had a chance of slipping through undetected. A formation would light up every radar screen and gun sight between Tangmere and Dieppe. If I don't come back, Mitchell told Pemberton, you'll need every man to keep this squadron flying. It wasn't sentiment. It was mathematics of a different kind, the arithmetic of survival that every combat commander learned to calculate in the currency of lives. At 09 to 3 hours, Mitchell climbed into Spitfire BR-549, a aircraft with 93 combat missions marked in small white crosses beneath the canopy. The ground crew had already fueled her and loaded ammunition, 4.303 Browning machine guns and 2 20mm Suspano cannons. Though Mitchell knew that if he had to fire those weapons, the mission had already failed. Flight Sergeant William Cooper, the crew chief, pressed a thermos of tea into Mitchell's hands. For after Sir Cooper said, and Mitchell understood that the man was giving him a reason to come back. Something as simple and profound as hot tea waiting on an English airfield. The Merlin engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with that distinctive growl that every pilot learned to read like a language. Mitchell ran through his checks with the automatic precision of repetition, fuel mixture rich, propeller pitch full fine. Trim tabs neutral, flaps up. The Spitfire trembled with restrained power, eager to fly, oblivious to the mission ahead. At 0931 hours, Mitchell released the brakes and felt the aircraft surge forward, accelerating down the rain-slicked runway until the wheels lifted and England fell away beneath him. He kept the Spitfire low, so low that his propeller wash kicked up spray from the channel's gray surface. The storm front worked in his favor, reducing visibility to less than 2 miles to Rabel for navigation, perfect for concealment. Mitchell flew by compass and instinct, holding a heading of 142 degrees, trusting that the mathematics of wind, speed, and aircraft velocity would deliver him to Dieppe rather than into the cliffs of Normandy. There were no landmarks at this altitude, just endless gray water and the occasional white cap that appeared and vanished in the murk. The flight across the channel took 17 minutes, though Mitchell's hands registered every second through the control column. The Spitfire bucked and yowed in the turbulent air, forcing constant corrections. Rain hammered against the canopy, reducing forward visibility to almost nothing. Mitchell flew partially on instruments, partially on the primitive radar detector that had been fitted to some squadron or crafter crewed device that buzzed when it detected German radar emissions. The buzzer remained silent. So far, he was invisible. The French coast appeared suddenly, a dark line that materialized from the storm like a theater curtain rising on a tragedy. Mitchell pulled back on the stick, climbing to 400 feet, high enough to see the battlefield, low enough to stay beneath most of the German flak coverage. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Dieppe was burning. The beaches were littered with destroyed landing craft, their hulls torn open like discarded cans. Bodies floated in the surf, moving with the tide. Canadian soldiers who would never see home again. Smoke rose from dozens of fires throughout the town, mixing with the low clouds to create a hellish twilight at 10 in the morning. Tracer fire arced across the harbor in both directions, the desperate last stands of Allied troops still fighting, and the methodical German response that was grinding them down. Mitchell counted 7 destroyed Churchill tanks on the esplanade, their hulls still smoldering. The raid had failed. This wasn't evacuation, it was slaughter. Finding 2 downed pilots in this chaos seemed impossible, except that Mitchell had one advantage the Germans didn't anticipate. Desperation breeds ingenuity. Before takeoff, he had been given the last known radio frequency that Thompson and Hughes might be monitoring. Mitchell keyed his radio transmitter, broadcasting in the clear, abandoning any pretense of security. Redbird 2, lost sheep. Redbird 2, lost sheep. If you can hear me, pop smoke. For 30 seconds, nothing. Mitchell circled the eastern edge of the battlefield, his eyes scanning the ruins below, his aircraft dancing through sporadic flak bursts that blossomed like black flowers in the rain. The Germans had spotted him, now a lone Spitfire where no Allied aircraft should be. Somewhere below, a battery commander was shouting coordinates, traversing guns, preparing to swat this impudent intruder from the sky. Then he saw yellow smoke, the international signal for friendly forces, rising from behind a collapsed building 3 blocks inland from the beach. It was them. It had to be them. Or it could be a trapped German soldiers who had monitored the same radio frequency, who understood that rescue attempts were predictable, who were positioning a machine gun nest at this exact moment. Mitchell had 3 seconds to decide whether to trust the smoke. Dav. The Spitfire screamed downward, engine howling, airframe shuddering, as Mitchell pushed the aircraft past its recommended stress limits. He leveled out at 50 feet, flying between buildings, his wingtips close enough to shattered windows that he could see the interiors of bombed apartments' furniture overturned. Lives interrupted the intimate debris of war. Machine gun fire chased him, tracers that seemed to move in slow motion until they flashed past his canopy at supersonic speeds. A Spitfire at 50 feet is not an easy target, but it only takes 1 bullet in the right place. Oil cooler, the glycol tank, the pilot's unarmored spine. Mitchell spotted them in a bomb crater behind what had once been a Bakery 2 figures in RAF flight gear, waving frantically. Thompson and Hughes, alive against all probability, hiding in a hole while an entire German garrison hunted them. But Mitchell's hope crashed as quickly as it had risen. The crater was in the middle of a street. There was no beach, no open space, nowhere to land a Spitfire. The landing gear would collapse on the Rubel. The propeller would strike debris. Landing here meant dying here and taking Thompson and Hughes with him when the Spitfire cartwheeled and exploded. Mitchell pulled up hard, climbing back to 400 feet, his mind racing faster than his engine. He had perhaps 2 minutes before German fighters responded to his presence. Already, his primitive radar detector was beginning to buzz. Intermittent, meaning aircraft were airborne but not yet committed to intercept. 2 minutes to solve an impossible problem. How to extract 2 men from a location where a Spitfire couldn't land? The answer came from memory, from a training exercise he had participated in 2 years earlier at RF Hen. The Royal Air Force had been experimenting with air-sea rescue techniques, including a controversial method called hook pickup, using a modified Spitfire to snag a cable attached to survival equipment, then towing down pilots from the water. The method had been abandoned as too dangerous, too unreliable, requiring precision that combat conditions couldn't guarantee. Mitchell had practiced it exactly 3 times. He had succeeded once, but the principle could be adapted. If he couldn't land, he could still make contact with the ground briefly, dangerously, with one wheel. If Thompson and Hughes could grab onto the landing gear at the exact moment of contact, if Mitchell could accelerate fast enough to lift back into the air before the Spitfire lost speed and stalled, if 1,000 other impossibilities aligned, it might work. It had never been attempted in combat. It violated every principle of aircraft operation. It was the only option left. Mitchell keyed his radio again. Lost sheep, listen carefully. I cannot land. I will make a low pass, 1 wheel down. When I pass, grab the landing gear and hold on. You understand? Thompson's voice came back, distorted by static and fear. Understood. God help you? Ooh. Mitchell dropped his left landing gear, only the left, keeping the right retracted to prevent the aircraft from cartwheeling if both wheels touched simultaneously. The Spitfire's handling immediately became asymmetric, wanting to roll left, forcing Mitchell to apply constant right aileron pressure. He lined up on the street, approaching from the east to give himself maximum distance from the German positions to the west. His airspeed was critical, too fast, and Thompson and Hughes couldn't grab on. Too slow, and the Spitfire would drop like a stone when they added their weight. He settled on 85 miles per hour, 15 miles per hour above stall speed, praying it was enough. The approach required every hour of Mitchell's flying experience. He held the Spitfire in a slight side slip, compensating for the single, extended gear, fighting the aircraft's desire to drop its left wing. The street rushed up to meet him, rubble and debris marking an obstacle course that left no room for error. 50 feet, 30 feet, 20. Mitchell eased the throttle back, feeling the Merlin's power bleed away. Feeling the aircraft settle toward the earth like a bird with a broken wing. The left wheel touched at precisely the moment Mitchell passed over the crater. He felt, rather than saw Thompson leap for the landing gear strut, felt the sudden additional weight as the pilot's hands found purchase on the wheel assembly. Then Hughes jumped, his hands grasping Thompson's waist. And suddenly Mitchell's Spitfire was carrying 400 additional pounds in the worst possible location, hanging beneath the aircraft's center of gravity like an anchor determined to drag them all into the ground. The Spitfire dropped, the left wheel, designed to support the aircraft's weight during normal landing. Now bore not only that weight, but also 2 full-grown men while the aircraft was still trying to fly. The tire compressed, the suspension bottomed out, and for a horrific instant, Mitchell felt the propeller tip strike the ground, a metallic shriek that sent vibrations through the entire airframe. He jammed the throttle forward to the emergency boost position, feeling the Merlin's supercharger scream in protest as it delivered 1,750 horsepower to the propeller. The Spitfire lurched forward, accelerating desperately, trying to transform speed into lift before the damaged propeller tore itself apart, 70 miles per hour. The end of the street was approaching a collapsed building that would kill them all if they didn't gain altitude. Mitchell could see Thompson and Hughes beneath him now, clinging to the landing gear, their bodies pressed flat against the wheel well, eyes squeezed shut. 80 miles per hour. The damaged propeller was creating a terrifying vibration, shaking the aircraft so violently that Mitchell's vision blurred. A collapsed building filled his windscreen, close enough to see individual bricks in the rubble. Mitchell pulled back on the control column with every ounce of strength. The Spitfire responded sluggishly, nose rising with agonizing slowness, clawing for altitude with the desperation of survival. The landing gear cleared the rubble by less than 3 feet. Mitchell heard something scrape against the well, a piece of timber, a fragment of roof tile, but then they were over climbing into the relative safety of altitude, with two pilots hanging beneath the aircraft in a configuration that no engineer had ever designed for. But they weren't safe yet. Mitchell's radar detector was now buzzing continuously, and moments later he saw them, two Focke-Wulf 190s, diving from 8,000 feet, their yellow cowlings distinctive even through the rain. The German pilots had spotted Mitchell's impossible rescue, and they were coming to finish the job with the professional thoroughness that made the Luftwaffe so lethal. Mitchell's damaged Spitfire, carrying two extra passengers in the worst possible aerodynamic configuration, could never outrun them. He couldn't even fight Backhenny, violent maneuvering would shake Thompson and Hughes loose, sending them plummeting to their deaths. Mitchell did the only thing he could. He dove for the deck, pushing the Spitfire back down to wavetop height, where speed and ground effect might give him a chance. The aircraft accelerated in the dive, the damaged propeller's vibration intensifying until Mitchell feared the entire engine would tear loose from its mounts. Behind and above, the two FW-190s followed, but they had to be careful. At 50 feet, there was no room for error, and the German pilots knew that shooting down Mitchell meant risking their own aircraft in the debris field. The chase across the channel became a bizarre test of endurance. Mitchell held the Spitfire so low that his propeller wash kicked up spray, creating a rooster tail behind him. The FW-190s remained at 500 feet, occasionally diving to take shots but unable to commit to a sustained attack. Their cannon shells kicked up waterspouts around Mitchell's aircraft, but hitting a target at 50 feet while diving required luck more than skill. Mitchell's only advantage was that the German pilots couldn't know about his passengers. They must have assumed the Spitfire was damaged and limping home, not that it was carrying two men clinging to the landing gear in a desperate bid for survival. 5 miles from the French coast, Mitchell's luck ran out. One of the FW-190s committed to a full attack run, diving until it was level with Mitchell's aircraft, matching his speed. Mitchell could see the German pilot in the cockpit, a young man, perhaps 25 years old, concentrating with professional intensity on lining up his gun sight. In that moment, Mitchell understood that they were both simply trying to survive the war that politicians had started and that pilots had to finish. But understanding changed nothing. The German's finger tightened on the firing trigger. Thompson saved them. Hanging beneath the Spitfire, buffeted by 200-mile-per-hour winds, somehow the RAF pilot saw the FW-190 approaching. He couldn't shout to Mitchell over the roar of the engine, couldn't signal with his hands because releasing his grip meant death, but he could move. Thompson kicked his legs violently, throwing his body weight to the left, creating just enough aerodynamic disturbance to make the Spitfire yaw at the crucial instant. The Germans' cannon shells passed through the space where Mitchell's cockpit had been half a second earlier, close enough that Mitchell smelled cordite and felt heat through the canopy. The FW-190 overshot, its speed too high for the low-altitude maneuvering. The pilot pulled up hard, climbing away to set up for another pass, but he had lost his advantage. Mitchell saw the English coast ahead, white cliffs barely visible through the rain, but unmistakably England. The German pilot saw it too, and made a calculation based on fuel, distance, and the certainty of British coastal defenses. The FW-190s turned back, waggling their wings in what might have been professional respect or simple acknowledgement that this fight was over. Mitchell maintained his altitude until he was sure the Germans had departed, then began the delicate process of climbing to landing altitude. Every 100 feet gained felt like a victory against physics. The damaged propeller continued its terrifying vibration. Thompson and Hughes continued their death grip on the landing gear, their hands probably frozen into position by now, muscles locked from 17 minutes of sustained terror. But they were over England, and at 1,000 feet Mitchell could see Raftangmere ahead, its runway a thin grey line in the rain. Landing presented the final, cruel problem. Normally, a pilot landing a Spitfire would reduce speed, drop both landing gear and touchdown at approximately 75 miles per hour. Mitchell couldn't do any of those things normally. His left landing gear was already down, with two pilots attached to it. His right landing gear might not extend properly, and even if it did, the aircraft's center of gravity was so disrupted that a normal landing would likely result in a ground loop or worse, and he had to land fast enough to maintain control, but slow enough that Thompson and Hughes would survive the impact. Mitchell radioed the tower. Tongue Tower, this is Mitchell, declaring emergency. I have two pilots attached to my left landing gear. Repeat, I have personnel on the landing gear. Need fire and rescue standing by. There was a long pause, then the tower controller's voice. Carefully professional, despite the insanity of Mitchell's report. Mitchell say again, "You're last. 2 pilots are hanging from my left landing gear. I'm coming in on left gear only. Recommend clearing the runway and having medics ready." Another pause. Mitchell imagined the scene in the tower controllers looking at each other, wondering if they had heard correctly, if Mitchell had suffered some sort of combat-induced hallucination. Then, understood, Mitchell, runway is yours. Fire cruiser rolling. Mitchell extended his right landing gear, hearing the hydraulic system groan but feeling the satisfying clunk as the wheel locked into position. Both wheels down now, though he had no idea if the damaged left assembly would collapse under the combined weight. He configured the Spitfire for landing flaps down, mixture rich, propeller full fin, began his final approach. The landing was less a controlled descent and more a managed crash. Mitchell brought the Spitfire in hot, maintaining 90 miles per hour until the last possible moment, then cutting power and flaring hard. The right wheel touched first, taking the initial impact. Then the left wheel and its human cargo contacted the runway. Mitchell felt something in the landing gear assembly give way, a strut or mounting brackebutt the gear held. The Spitfire bounced once, settled, and rolled out. Mitchell stood on the brakes, bringing the aircraft to a stop in less than 500 yards, then immediately cut the engine. The silence after shutdown was absolute. For 17 seconds, nobody moved. Then the fire crews arrived, and ground personnel rushed forward to extract Thompson and Hughes from the landing gear. Both pilots were conscious but couldn't stand. Their hands had locked into the position from gripping the metal struts, their bodies battered by 17 minutes of exposure to 200-mile-per-hour winds. Medics had to physically pry their fingers open, then carried them to waiting ambulances on street. Mitchell remained in the cockpit for another minute, hands still on the controls, unable to quite believe they had survived. Flight Sergeant Cooper appeared at the wing route that promised thermos of tea in his hands. "Well flown, sir," Cooper said, as if Mitchell had just completed a routine training flight rather than the most improbable rescue mission in HARF history. Mitchell accepted the tea and drank it there in the cockpit, while rain continued to fall in the Battle of Britain airfield, washing away the smoke and sweat, but not the memory of what desperation could accomplish. The butcher's bill for Operation Jubilee came due that evening. Of the 6,086 men who had embarked for Dieppe, 3,623 became casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. The Royal Air Force lost 106 aircraft and 81 aircraft. The Royal Navy lost 1 destroyer and 33 landing craft. The Canadian Army's 2nd Division was effectively destroyed as a fighting force, with some battalions suffering casualty rates exceeding 70%. The raid's objectives testing amphibious assault techniques, destroying German installations, capturing Enigma materials had almost all failed. But to RAF pilots who should have died behind enemy lines were instead recovering in the Tangmere infirmary with nothing more serious than severe bruising, exposure, and trauma. Thompson would return to combat operations 6 weeks later. Hughes, less fortunate, suffered permanent nerve damage in his hands from the sustained grip on the landing gear, ending his flying career but not his life. Both men survived the war. Both returned to families who would never fully understand what their salvation had required. Mitchell's Spitfire BR-549 was surveyed by ground crews who documented 43 bullet holes, a propeller with 7 damaged blades, a collapsed left landing gear, a cracked engine mount, and stress fractures throughout the airframe. The technical inspection officer declared the aircraft beyond economical repair. BR-549 was stripped for parts and her fuselage used for battle damage training. But before she was dismantled, the ground crew added one more marking beneath the canopy, 2 white crosses, different from all the others, representing not kills but lives saved. Squadron Leader James Mitchell flew 37 more combat missions before the end of the war. He never attempted another rescue mission like the Dieppe operation, though he was asked twice. "Lightning doesn't strike the same place twice," he told Air Vice Marshal Lima, "and miracles don't repeat on demand." Mitchell survived the war, retired from the RAF in 1946 with a Distinguished Flying Cross and bar, and never spoke publicly about the Dieppe rescue. His official logbook entry for August 19, 1942 reads simply, "Patrol over Dieppe. 1 aircraft damaged, 2 personnel recovered. 1.2 hours. The military lessons from Dieppe were harsh but necessary." The amphibious assault failures informed planning for D-Day less than 2 years later. The RAV's air superiority tactics were revised, reducing the emphasis on aggressive fighter sweeps that had proven so costly. The coordination between air, sea, and land forces was completely restructured. Dieppe was a disaster that taught the Allies how to avoid disaster on a larger scale. Every soldier who survived D-Day owed something to the men who died at Dieppe, proving what didn't work. But there's another lesson in Mitchell's impossible flight, one that transcends tactics and strategy. In the calculus of war, where generals move divisions like chess pieces and statisticians count casualties and percentages, individual acts of courage remain defiantly incalculable. Mitchell's decision to fly alone into the most heavily defended section of the French coast violated every principle of risk management. His improvised rescue technique had never been approved, never been tested, never been considered anything but dangerously reckless. By every rational measure, his mission should have failed, adding 3 more casualties to Dieppe's already catastrophic toll. Yet courage has never operated on rational principles. It exists in that strange space where human will confront mathematical impossibility and decides that mathematics can go to hell. Mitchell flew through enemy lines not because he calculated the odds and found them favorable, but because 2 men were trapped and someone had to try. The radar detected him, the flak gunners tracked him, the enemy fighters hunted him, and still he flew lower, slower, more vulnerable than any tactical doctrine would permit. Because courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something matters more than fear. In the decades after the war, historians have debated Dieppe endlessly. Was it a necessary rehearsal for D-Day or a wasteful catastrophe? Was the intelligence gathered worth the lives lost? Could better planning have changed the outcome? These are important questions, the kind that military academies study and documentarians explore. But they miss what Mitchell's flight represents, the irreducible human element that refuses to fit into strategic planning or historical analysis. On August 19, 1942, while thousands died on the beaches of Dieppe and dozens of aircraft fell from the sky, one pilot decided that 2 lives mattered enough to risk his own. He flew a damaged aircraft carrying 2 men in a configuration that no engineer would approve, outran fighters that should have shot him down, and landed safely because sometimes desperate courage finds a way through impossible circumstances. Thompson and Hughes survived because Mitchell flew through enemy lines to save his squadron, and in doing so proved that even in war's most mechanized, calculated brutality, individual human decisions can still tip the scales between life and death. The lesson isn't that heroism always succeeds. Most of the time, it doesn't. Most of the time, the brave pilot gets shot down. The rescue mission fails. The story ends in a crater in France rather than a safe landing in England. But Mitchell's flight reminds us why we still honor courage even when it fails. Because the willingness to try, to risk everything for others, represents something that statistics and strategy can never fully quantify. It's the difference between existing and living, between surviving a war and being worthy of the peace that follows. Squadron Leader James Mitchell died in 1987, age 76, in a quiet cottage in Sussex. His obituary in the Times mentioned his distinguished RAF service but said nothing about Dieppe. Mitchell had never submitted a public account, never sought recognition, never treated his actions as anything more than duty fulfilled. At his funeral, 2 elderly men attended who weren't family members. Robert Thompson, age 69, and David Hughes, age 7, stood in the rain at Mitchell's grave and did not speak. They didn't need to. Some deaths are too profound for words, and some acts of courage are their own memorial, written not in stone but in the lives they saved.